And there's lots of sort of strategies within that, and Channel 4 pulled out 5 that it wanted to explore in games. Reflection is a really critical aspect of staying happy. So the ability to accurately reflect on the past, to look back at things that have happened and have a good judgment on whether they were good things or bad things, whether they were your fault or not your fault, is incredibly valuable in preserving your mental equilibrium. Experiencing competency, absolutely key. Doesn't matter what it is, just having the chance to be good at something is this extraordinary kind of mental inoculation that helps you kind of defend yourself against all kinds of mental difficulties. Relatedness is really, really critical. The relationships that we have in life, investing energy on the people around us, identifying what are good relationships and what are bad relationships, experiencing both directions of communication in those relationships, of both asking for help and giving help. All of these things are incredibly important for mental resilience. Agency, critical. Knowing that you have the power to change things, understanding that you can reach out into the world and make a difference. In a small way or a big way, doesn't matter, but critical element for feeling happy. And persistence, unbelievably important. Not giving up, understanding that failure is a necessary step on the path to success, that actually kind of an extension of the marshmallow test, that practice can be very important, that doing something boring that doesn't accomplish anything over and over again can be worth it in the long run because it lets you unlock something else. But holy cow, how many of those are core game design elements? Okay, anyone in the room who's a designer is going to be looking at those going, well, you know, agency is a critical part of what game design is all about. Competence is a huge component of it. Persistence, that failing till you succeed thing. There's so many elements within this that map really closely onto game design. And that started to get really interesting. So this started to grow into a project which I'll talk you through in a minute called SuperMe. It's worth saying, just because it'll otherwise get a little bit confusing, that because SuperMe is for teens and because that word list is a ghastly list of horrible nouns, these terms got translated on the SuperMe site into slightly more palatable versions of the same principles. And all of that produced SuperMe, which is a site with information and videos and quizzes and top tips and games, all of which are designed to help you develop better mental resilience and have a more positive attitude when things go wrong in your life. And the games were kind of designed to try and pull particular principles out of that list and try and encapsulate them in game design terms. So kind of taking the rubbish, flawed, scrappy thing that I'd done in the Marshmallow game and try and make them into something sort of much more meaningful. So this is one of the 4 games that we made in the end to go with this. This is a very simple game. It's a gravity-based game. Anyone who has happy memories of Spaced Penguin would be very good at this. So all you've got to do is ping the ball into the hole and avoid the massive gravitational distortions. And this was an interesting foray into trying to think about how we could make gaming more reflective. So how we can make gaming not just being about achieving the task that's put in front of you right now, but having a clear perspective on the things that have happened to you in the past. And I'll talk about this more because it's one of the really interestingly difficult problems in the heart of this. For SuperMe, we came up with a really, really simple system, which is simply that there are bonus rounds at the end of each round which ask you to remember accurately something that you've previously done in the game. So you need a spatial memory of a level layout from a few levels ago, or you need to know stuff about how much power you used or how many super guides you have left. Crude, but effective in terms of just starting to encourage those mental processes of looking back on something that's happened, but being required to make sure that you're not mistaking it. It's amazing how much you can get this wrong, that when the game asks you how many goes did it take you to finish this level, your brain has often already started to distort it, that you thought, if you were finding it difficult, you think it's way more than it was, or you forget if you're cruising through it that actually you have been failing kind of consistently a couple of times at the beginning of each level. This is Flomo. Oh, Flomo's lovely. So this is a game about competence. This is a game about experiencing the joy of being good at something. And we wanted to not just provide that feeling, but provide evidence of that feeling. And so Your only goal in Flomo is the ball will roll left to right. This is a video game after all. And you're trying to collect the rings by jumping through them. And as you go, you will start to meet obstacles and platforms and things that you need to navigate in order to continue to proceed. But the better you are and the more rings you collect, the more the world comes to life. So the whole thing blooms and all of these rainbows grow out of the background, and the level fills with colour, and the music changes, and you have this, you're kind of swept along in this whole fantastic world that then, if you lose your flow, you start to, that starts to drop away and everything goes back into monochrome. And it's surprisingly powerful that when you lose that energy, you start to feel kind of quite kind of dismayed by not having it around you anymore. This was very interesting. GBA fans may recognise the inspiration behind this. This is a multiplayer race game, a dot racing game, you might call it, with a difference. The difference being that you're not trying to beat each other. So 4 players, 3 currently on the screen. Each player is different coloured dot. You're manoeuvring through this landscape. But you score points collaboratively by staying together. So that white band running down the middle is those 3 players getting bonus points for being in the same part of the screen at the same time. And as you go through the level, you've got lots of different bonuses that you have to pick up. So that little colour wheel in the middle is a bonus for any player. These ones they're coming up to are bonuses for specific players. There are speed boosts, which look great, and your gamer brain tells you to go for them, but actually, of course, you start to lose points if you don't all hit the speed boost. So you'll often find actually that if you're a good player, you'll have to start sabotaging yourself and trying to find ways to slow down so that you can keep together. It becomes a really interesting herding game where you all try and occupy the same space. So this is going to very obviously digging in specifically to this issue of relatedness and trying to emphasise the, to both your gameplay and visually represent. Because of course the joy is when you get 4 people who are good at it, you're making this brilliant continuous rainbow that looks fantastic and kind of really visually reinforces the value of what you're trying to do. And this is Lincoln. This actually was originally supposed to be a game that was also looking at exploring relatedness and connections. So this is a game, it's kind of, well, it's not remotely like, yeah, it's really hard to explain it in terms of other games. You shoot these beads up from the bottom, and orange beads are strong and white beads are weak. So there are strong connections and weak connections. And the white connections can only take the weight of 2 orange beads before they break if you add a third. So that white bead in the column that's cracked will break if you add another orange one. What you're trying to do, in fact, the orange beads that have fallen down have just fallen from the white bead that cracked. What you're trying to do is line up the orange ones in lines of 4 or more, and then they disappear. There's lots of specials. The next on the left shows you a special. That special is going to flip an entire row of orange to white. And actually, very rapidly, this became a game about agency, because you can do such big flips, you totally change the character of the game board from moment to moment. That you take a row that is a disaster. So at the moment, that row of 4 whites, that's a disaster. That's doing nothing for you. There's 0 point scoring ability there. But because of the flippers, that can go from being a disaster to being a big score opportunity in a heartbeat. It's a little bit Ikaruga, for anyone who's an Ikaruga fan. And that was kind of really powerful. And actually, it's I do, this is utterly subjective and entirely anecdotal, but I do find this game elevates my mood, that if I spend 20 minutes doing this, at the end of it I feel better about all kinds of things. So that's how we tackled it on SuperMe, how we tried to actually meaningfully embed some of those principles in these Flash games that we made. But I suspect that some of you are thinking, well, that's all well and good for that kind of stuff, but what about real games? I'm a console gamer at heart. I grew up on that stuff. It's always kind of important to think about how those games, how bigger games, bigger budgets, catering for mass audiences with a whole bunch of other limitations and requirements on them in terms of the kind of tone they have to have and the visual style they have to have, the content that will serve the audience that they sell to. So how on earth do you take these kind of principles and put them into those kind of games? All kinds of mayhem is going on. And actually, it's really easy. There's lots of games that already do it really well without necessarily using it as a deliberate strategy. If you look at reflection, you know, we took a stab at it in the Super Me games, but actually a game that does it really nicely is Fable 2. Is a game that has a long memory of what you've done, and that as you return to the village and towns, as you go through your life in the game, villagers there will remember things about you, will make comments about you, that there'll be a kind of sense of legacy. And that's really powerful, although it's interesting that actually that's not causing the player to reflect, it's the game reflecting back at the player. And we found that almost every strategy that we tried to come up with fell into that trap, that it's really easy to get the game to reflect back at you things that you've done, but to require the player in any meaningful way to think back over their own activities is really, really difficult. And we're still working on a bunch of ideas about how that might work, about what the options might be to really meaningfully kind of introduce that. Competence, obviously there are a massive, in fact, effectively all games fall into this category. I've recently gone back to Geometry Wars 2 to do final battle with pacifism and see if I can crack it. And it's been really interesting, really deconstructing that game, and particularly looking at how the level structure works within it in terms of the escalation of enemies, the different waves, the escalation of the number of enemies. It's so perfectly calibrated. Because what's interesting about competence and interesting about flow, which is a word that gets bandied around a lot in the context of the Csikszentmihalyi text about flow and how, which has become an absolute cornerstone for a lot of game design principles. The crucial thing about flow is not just about being good at something, is not just about being at the point where you're at the height of your competence. It's always about being edged slightly beyond that. It's about being in a state where you don't quite believe that you can do it, but yet somehow it's happening. And Geometry Wars does that amazingly well. It's a gossamer thin line of trying to take somebody to the very edge of their ability. There's a whole bunch of, I could talk for hours about this, there's a whole bunch of other stuff about zones of proximal learning that are really interesting here in terms of just how productive and fulfilling it is to get that right and put somebody in a space where they're achieving something that is actually beyond their current ability, but that they can still master because of the support that they have around them. Really, really interesting stuff. Relatedness is lovely. Something that is much easier for us now in games because a whole bunch of stuff is online. But actually, my favourite relatedness game, my favourite multiplayer game, is this. And this is where I really get to test your chops. See if anyone can crack. Anyone's... No? There are clues. It should be burn on your brain in agony. Who was that? Yeah, but which? Burn, Water Temple. It's the Water Temple. God bless you. So, Water Temple, burned in an entire generation's brains, right? Because that was hard, and it was, for those of you who haven't played, it was a really, really three-dimensional puzzle with a load of switches to raise and lower water that reconfigured kind of access, and it was incredibly brain-melting and really, really difficult. Miyamoto designed that as a multiplayer game. Ocarina of Time is completely single-player, has absolutely no infrastructure, but he deliberately designed the Water Temple so that you would have to talk to your friends about it. You would have to pool your resources. There was no way everyone was going to get through this on their own. And this is way back when even GameFAQs wasn't that widespread. There wasn't the support community that there is now. This was really about reconnecting people at a, dare I say, water cooler level, where actually communication, where actually being able to talk and I mean, this is exactly mirroring all of the research about the value of using relatedness, that having the experience of asking for help and being able to offer help back to people within this game environment is incredibly interesting. And there's a massive amount of stuff that we could be doing with this that we're not.